Hi, welcome to AGJ 160, Media Writing, Stories and Content. This week we're talking about interviewing. So we start by talking about what is an interview, then we'll talk about different kinds of interviews and advice for interviewers. An interview is a formalised conversation between two parties in order to gather information. So it is a formalised construct based on two or more parties, usually two parties, the interviewer and the interviewee, agreeing on a subject matter, agreeing on the roles of the two people, one being the interviewer, one being the interviewee, and agreeing on things like a time and a place, and especially agreeing on the purpose of the interview. So if the interview is for a journalism project, then the interviewee should know that and know that their opinions or their whatever they're going to say is going to go out to the public domain. Other ones might be more off the record, background information interviews, or they may be interviews for colour. You're getting someone's opinions and viewpoints of the past, or some sort of profile, or something like that. But there's a whole lot of different reasons for an interview. But I've broken these rationale into two broad categories. So the first one is a way of collecting practical information about a subject. So, so if you need information and there is an expert or an eyewitness or an important person with credibility who can speak to a particular idea or a particular phenomenon or situation, then that is a good reason to interview them. The other reason might be to elicit someone's thoughts, feelings, and opinions on a subject. So it's more about the profile, about who the interviewee is, the person. And of course, these two rationale cross over quite a bit in a number of ways, but we will discuss that more as we go along. So why do we interview? We interview, in terms of news and journalism, we interview a lot because it gives whatever we're writing and producing, it gives it credibility and authenticity beyond that of just the journalists themselves. So it demonstrates that the writer has actually spoken to someone in authority, someone with expert opinions, someone who is relevant to the story. They haven't just made up the story. And it's like when you do academic research and you need to have sources. And the quotes are evidence of the sources. It's a way of saying that these viewpoints exist have been tested. They exist in the public sphere. They are they're real and credible. So that's an important part of news and journalism. But that whole rationale also stretches out to other things too, to other media, to documentary, even to kind of research-based ideas for fiction or whatever. You interview to get a credible and authoritative voice. Another media form forms the interview as a tool to gather expert opinion on or first-hand account that may contribute to the credibility and colour of a fictional work. So, for example, if you're doing a fiction work on earthquakes and you want to write a scene where some people survive an earthquake, you might think of, and if you haven't experienced that yourself, you might think, oh, well, an earthquake is shaking buildings and people are trapped with fear and they hide under tables or whatever. But it might be worthwhile to actually interview people who have survived earthquakes to see what was the actual sensation that they went through. What did they witness? What did they feel? What did they experience? What was the aftermath like for them? And it may be different to your imagined perspective on what happened. That the real perspective, they may say that there was quite a lot of adrenaline. They may say that it's quite exciting for a little bit, and then it became really frightening, or the rooms they were in reacted differently from what you imagined, or whatever. So that is another reason why you might interview, to get to get an eyewitness account that adds colour to a piece of fiction. And of course, academic work and research work needs its own forms of interview. These can be research interviews for quantitative study, so you can interview people about their experiences, and then that becomes a part of a data collection that you can use for academic work. And of course, in strategic communications and public relations, you interview quite a bit. If you're working in-house, you sometimes interview people that are working within your organisation to see what they're doing, so you can put out media about their occupations or whatever. But also, you need to interview people for a number of reasons, just for if they're in the public domain, if you're working as an advocate for them. So the interview as an object, as a tool, as a device, is not just about those traditional things like news and journalism, but you think of things like law, medicine, as I said, academic work, as a range of occupations and fields where you need to elicit information from subjects, and the interview is the primary device for that. So we can talk about on-screen and behind-the-screens interview. Some interviews are media events. They are a conversation that itself becomes something that the audience might consume, whether it be in broadcast media or digital media, or whatever. But here the roles of the two participants are very clearly articulated. Obviously because of the staging of the event, there's no ambiguity about what is going on and what the roles are, and there's a strong performative aspect to it too. So both parties play their roles very overtly. But then other interviews are more behind the scenes interviews. This may be again the research interview or the off the record interview, and these may be a little bit a little bit muddier, a little bit messier in terms of the way that they're structured. They may take more time. They may be over a longer period of time and have a series of smaller interviews conducted. A good example of that would be someone who's writing a biography of a subject. So it won't just be sitting down with that person and saying tell me about your life. It may be living with that person for a period of time, or visiting them over a year or something like that in their houses to see what their life is like and what their other relationships are like, and the interview may be kind of just a process of being with that person over a period of time. So they're not there's no single way that an interview can be conducted. I think that those on-screen interviews are the ones that we classically think of, but even in that there's a range of different forms that interviews can take. So you have those very sympathetic interviews, soft interviews where it's all about eliciting information from the subject. It's about projecting a sense of friendliness, etc. But then you'll have harder interviews where more confrontational type of interviews, and again they're both performative. They're both performing a particular act. So when you watch something like Fox News and Sean Hannity or someone like that on Fox News, and he's always talking over his subjects and being rude to them and not letting them get a word in edgeways, that isn't, although you might want to know what they're hearing, that's a very deliberate type of performance that he is undertaking. He is performing the idea that although this is essentially an interview, it's actually, the interviewer's dominance of the situation. So, there's quite an interesting ideological bent to that. I will just kind of go through these a little bit more with the types of interviews. So, as I said, the research interview can be informal. It can be, a background interview. It can be a way to gather information in a friendly environment. So, for example, if you are, you may find yourself in some role, like journalism or some other role like this, and that you're going to be interviewing a significant or famous person, or a well-known person, or a person of significant, of great importance. So you might be interviewing a high-ranking politician or a high-ranking sports person or someone like this. doing your own research is very good, and you can find a lot of stuff out about this person, but sometimes it pays to do some background interviews as well. So you might want to interview journalists who have interviewed them in the past and say, well, look, I'm about to interview I don't know, Peter Dutton. I'm about to interview Peter Dutton. What's he like as an interviewer, as an interviewee? And they might say, oh, look, he's actually, he's very professional about this, but he does get really annoyed if you, veer off topic, or he might, he's often very sort of short of time, so you have to get your questions in very well. So those are the sort of interviews that you might do before you do a big interview, so a research interview like that. And of course, research interviews also account for things like the qualitative and quantitative data that you do in academic work. The key player interview is an interview with the main spokesperson on the subject. This could be a politician or a CEO. And this gives you credibility and gravitas to your story. Sometimes when you're sometimes key players are different from spokespeople. So a good example of this is oil companies, big oil companies. And oil companies, because they're really significant companies which have huge amounts of capital, invest in large infrastructure, and of course can be very politically and geopolitically problematic because they're worth a lot of money, but also they can be seen as polluting objects. They often have a very strong layer of public relations and in-house communications. So within that they will have spokespeople who are communications managers, but they are often not the key players. The key players might be the chief financial officers or the chief executives or the chairman of these big companies. And you have, you'll get a particular line from the media people, which is always very highly boisterous towards whatever's going on. But the CEOs and the executives, they have greater public credibility in terms of what you're asking. So, if you're interviewing, if you're wanting to write a story on one of these big organisations, to demarcate between the communication specialists and the key players is a very important thing. And then we have the eyewitness interview. So this adds credibility and colour to a story. As I said with our earthquake scenario, it can give you good background, but also in news and anything else. It just adds, it lifts and it adds colour. It's like a quote. Quotes lift and add colour to a story. An eyewitness lifts and add colour to a story. You may have already accessed this video before, but I will just show it. This is one of my favourite eyewitness interviews from American television from a couple of years ago. I'm very fond of that interview. I'm very fond of that particular eyewitness. So I think that would be gold to have that person there. Perhaps their credibility might be a little bit askew because they may be embellishing what they've seen a little bit, but the animation, uh, uh, the fireworks of rhetoric coming out of him is just so wonderful that I think I would just hope that what he's saying is true because I liked him so much. So again, we have the idea of the expert, and this can be the key player, but also this can be part of the research interview. That who is an expert in the subject. We're very fortunate working in universities because there are always lots of experts, and if you're doing some research, again, if it's journalism, if it's fiction, if it's any sort of producing some sort of content, if you have someone who is a university expert that is highly recognised as a strong notion of expertise. So say you're doing a piece on sharks or something like this. To get a zoologist who works on sharks, that automatically gives it credibility. So universities, people who research for a living are really good sources to talk. And the other thing about talking to university people is they often really like talking about their subjects. They get very excited about delivering information about their subject that they spend their lives thinking and writing about to a wider audience. So I think it's a very rich vein to tap for your work. And then there's the profile interview. These are, as I said earlier, about the two rationales for interviews. These are about eliciting someone's thoughts and feelings and opinions on a subject. They are often I wouldn't say soft as such, but they're often more they're sympathetic. They're like the opposite of the Hannity interview where it's all confrontational. They're there to let the subject speak. They're there because you want the subject's views on something. You want to know what makes them tick. A good profile interview seemed very simple when you watch them for the interviewer, because they just ask some questions and lets the interviewee talk. And we usually just see the most successful ones because those are the ones that have become part of the the public domain. But there is actually quite a skill in bringing out that information in a person. And you must know yourselves just from knowing a lot of people that some people can do nothing and you don't really like them and you don't want to open up to them. Other people can do nothing but you like them and you want to open up to them. So there's sort of certain personal chemistry going on as well in all interviews, but especially in the profile interview. I have an example here of it's one of my favourite examples. It's quite old. It's from an interview conducted by Melvyn Bragg, who was one of Britain's foremost arts writers and commentators, and he's interviewing playwright Dennis Potter just before he died. And I won't try. I don't think I'll be able to show the whole clip, but I'll show a little bit of it because I'm very fond of it. I think that's a very beautiful interview, and I think what Dennis Potter was saying there still holds true 25 years later, 25 years after he died. I think his words are still salient, and I showed that clip partly because I love watching the profile interview. We didn't really see Melvin Bragg there. He just asked these very kind of gentle questions and let Potter go. I mean, it's it's almost too good an example of the profile interview to be meaningful, but it's also a wonderful thing for us as writers and media thinkers to think about those words that are being said. So there was an ulterior motive in showing that one. So soft profiles, something like the Dennis Potter interview might be soft per se, perhaps, because both parties were very willing. The subject was, the interviewer was, allowed to give, the subject time and space. But there's also a political bent to the media. There's political bent to interviews. There always is. There always is. And I'm a great believer that everything is political. So, whatever interview you're doing, again, and this doesn't just relate to news and journalism. It relates to kind of all forms of communication, all forms of information transfer. There's an element of politics in there, but especially when you're dealing with kind of the public sphere and in the more kind of overt political arena, interviews are very, very powerful, and how they're conducted and what they're about and how control operates. There's just an example here that I wanted to talk about was the Jimmy Fallon interview during the Trump's election campaign. Trump famously, he is famously loathed by all the late night TV show hosts like Stephen Colbert, Seth Meyers, all those people, Jimmy Kimmel. They're all very sort of anti-Trump in their rhetoric, and Fallon was like this as well. And in the campaign, Trump, never appeared on any of these shows, but he did appear on Fallon, and this was greeted with a bit of anticipation because I thought Fallon, could ask him a couple of tough questions. It was a very siloed media during the campaign. Trump stuck to his more comfortable media that he knew was going to get a good run on him, and the anti-Trump media would continue their rhetoric. So this was kind of a meeting of the two parties, as it were. But in doing so, Fallon gave him a very soft interview. He gave him a ridiculously soft interview, and it sort of ruined Fallon's cred. It ruined Fallon's credibility as he can't really be anti-Trump now because he had his chance to ask some tough questions, and he really, really blew it. I won't show that clip, but it is there. The URL is there if you want to see it. So just some sort of more practical things, the things that you might kind of be faced with. Interviewing vulnerable people. This is a very common situation for journalism students, but also for all media people. And I think there are things that we firstly, how do we categorise vulnerable people? I think when you're at university and you go through an ethics process, which you need to do often when you're interviewing people, or at least some sort of consent process, you can situate vulnerability in terms of things like young people from minority backgrounds, or new migrants, but also people who have suffered some sort of traumatic situation, perhaps with PTSD, or people with disabilities and these type of people. But I think, and you will, in whatever media form that you work in, you will more than likely actually interview people in this situation probably quite often, especially if you're in news and journalism, and eyewitness accounts and news stories and all that sort of thing. You often speaking to people like this, but also in research and in fiction research and that sort of thing. So I think there are kind of practical things that we can think about making sure consent is given, making sure that the interviewee has plenty of information, they have support, you are courteous and respectful, you are prepared, and you get plenty of advice on what environment you're in and that sort of thing, how you use language. You might give people an opportunity to review what they've said before you publish it and all those sort of things. But I think what's most important, and again we might talk about this a little bit more, an interview is very much you as the interviewer, you call the shots. It's something that you lead and you're in control with. So, the people who are being interviewed by you, they've agreed to this situation. They want you to tell them what to do and how to act and where you're going to be. So you have to control them. It's your job to make them feel comfortable. It's your job to make sure they're not particularly traumatized. That doesn't mean that you give people soft interviews, but it means that, you have a duty of care beyond just the conversation. There's a lot going on in an interview. There's a lot of pastoral things going on in an interview. There's a lot of psychological things going on in an interview. People are actually giving up a lot of themselves sometimes and speaking to you when they consent to be interviewed. So how do we go about interviewing? I can't stress this enough, but you want to do as much planning as you can. You may have you may have got a background interview and spoken to someone, and you remember the who, where's, what's, and why's. The W things is a good place to start. But even if you don't have a lot of time, do as much research as you can. So, quick internet research might be okay for some things, but sometimes you need deep interviews. But never go into an interview without knowing anything. Again, that comes down to courtesy, but it's also good for you too. They can be quite stressful situations for interviewers as well as interviewees. So if you really know your subjects, like going into an exam with some planning, if you really, really, really know your subject, it will be a far more enjoyable and productive experience, because you'll be able to get a lot more out of it. But if you go in totally cold, you know nothing about the person, you don't know, you might make mistakes. The person will know that, they will sense that, and they will be uncomfortable. You'll both be uncomfortable, and the information that you elicit will not be as good. So always do background planning, or always do research. Understand the subject as well as the person as well. So, you might be interviewing, a particular expert. Just get to know a little bit about this. Don't just go, so for example, you'd say, well, you're a, geologist. What does a geologist do? You don't go in that cold. Go in, knowing a little bit about something, so you can at least converse on some kind of, you're higher up than absolute ignorance. The interviewee will respect that, and again, it will make the process a little bit more engaging. Write notes. But not essentially while you're interviewing, but beforehand. So this is part of your research. Draft an outline of where you want the interview to go and what angle you want to take. I mean, that doesn't mean that you're always heading in a particular direction and you will steadfast do that. But don't go into an interview without an idea of the question line that you want to ask. So, for example, if you're doing an entertainment interview and someone's just released a new film or something like that, but actually there's another issue that's just arisen in their background, and you want them to talk about that, and they of course want to just talk about their movie, you're going to have to find ways of gathering through that. That's a fairly kind of cliched example, but it's more, again, this comes down to the idea of planning. So do some research, make notes. I really like notes. Make lots of notes, writing things down, a bit like the interview where if speaking changes the dynamic, writing notes changes the dynamic of something. And again, decide on the point of the interview. And why is this interview happening? Why are you speaking to this person? What is the public interest in this? And sometimes this can be asked by an interviewee halfway through an interview if it's not going well. They can say, well, why do you want to talk to me about this? Why am I giving you this information? So, you need to say, as the interviewer, why is this? Why do I need to speak to you? Well, you're the head of an oil company, and we know there's been I don't know, poor work practices on some of your oil rigs, off the coast of India or something like this. This is why we need to speak to you. These kind of things. So it's basically about knowing what the situation is. Right, both general and specific questions. Okay, so general questions, we know what they are. The broader questions, do you think that there is a future for oil in the world? Or do you think, that we will all go to renewables one day? And then specific questions like, do you feel guilty for the deaths of those workers or something like that? So it's like when you're writing and you want to break up the sentences. So you don't always want to have long sentences and short sentences. You don't want to have, you're not always kind of having big shouty quotes. Sometimes you're having quiet quotes or whatever. I mean, it's all a case of making the situation, the interview, more engaging for, firstly, yourself, secondly, your interviewee, and thirdly, your audience, in different orders, not in that order, I don't know, in no particular order perhaps. But it's really important to see this as, as something of a whole, a whole with a W. They are interesting and they are performative. Even research ones are performative because it might be you and the other person. And it's you've got to make these things interesting and engaging. Remember to write open questions, one that don't encourage just a yes or no answer. So for example, instead of saying, do you see a future for oil in the world? They might just say yes, but instead you could ask, what is the future of oil in the world? Well, that elicits a more engaging answer. It makes the interviewee think about what they're saying a little bit more, and it gives you, more copy, more words. And of course, write questions tailored to the planned length of the interview. Don't, have a big meandering opening question that means nothing if you've only got 5 minutes or 10 minutes with the subject. Listen and respond. I used to teach radio. It was very interesting when I got students to do live radio interviews because they're very stressful situations. And they may have done lots of research and they would have a whole list of questions and they would be doing really well. And they would ask their interviewee a question. The interviewee would answer, but give quite an interesting answer that leave the audience saying, well, can you follow on from that? But the interviewer, because they're so stressed with being in that situation, would not even listen to the response, would just go on to the next question. Although interviewing is very much a case of planning and getting ready and researching, you also have to be very aware of the dynamics when you are being when you're actually in the middle of the conversational process. To listen to the exact answers being given to you and to think, where do they sit in context of the questions that I'm asking? What is the surprising information here? And they may be, being quite truthful and responding really nicely, and giving you some really interesting stuff. But it's your job to actually listen to it. It's your job to understand it, and it's your job to follow up and to ask further questions. And this is not just a case of knowing what is important and what is not. It's not, that is contextual. What it is what is important to my audience. What is important to, the people that are listening to it. Again, if it's a research interview, it may have more, further layers of process before it becomes a more, public object. But but whatever. It's up to you to decide what is kind of interesting and what you want to follow up with. All different media, interviews are used in all different media. This is just an example that I really, really like. But I also, I think, the idea of the print story interview, I'm quite a fan of text, and I like writing. So this is, an example I want to talk about. The print story is, you can do quite a lot with it. It's like radio. Sometimes I think the more elaborate the media, the less flexible it is. So a big broadcast interview, there's not much you can do. It's just that and that. You can do some editing and that sort of thing. But you can be really creative with things like radio, and you can be really creative with print. And this is an example that I really like. It's Bill Zemmy's 1990 Rolling Stone interview with Warren Beatty. And Warren Beatty is a famously difficult interview subject, and he doesn't like talking to the press, and is always giving very difficult interviews. And Bill Zemmy had this very problematic interview with him, and he thought, how am I going to convey how difficult this interview is? So he wrote up his interview in this Q&A form, which is quite a conventional form of setting out an interview on print. But he also added these fantastic italicized descriptions of how long silences were between words. So 21-second pause, 11-second pause, 47-second pause. I think that's just a great example of what you can do with print. And of course, print allows you to add some sort of really interesting flourish and colour and description. Those sort of things that are possibly out of your hands a little bit more if you're dealing with other media. It'd be quite interesting to do exercises, and I know this has been done in other journalism programs and writing programs, is to take something like the Dennis Potter interview and write that up as a feature story. So to see how you can kind of describe faces, describe voices, describe situations, describe rooms. So remember the practicalities of your interview. Don't spend too long on one interview if you only need one quote. Good for news journalists. Okay, one thing that we think that in news and journalism there may be a preconception that people don't want to talk to the press, or they don't want to talk to people who do an interview. Often it's the other way around. People love talking to. Some people love talking to people if they're being interviewed, and they will talk and talk and talk and talk, and you've got to work out whether they're valuable, whether they're interesting and relevant. And that sort of thing. And sometimes, you have to treat people not as your friend. They might think you're their friend, but you just need them for that one quote and move on. Okay, make sure you talk to the right expert. I know that we've talked about there are lots of expertise around, but make sure you've got the right one. Again, planning and research is important. Make sure your recording technology is working. That goes without saying, but that's one flaw thing that we often fall back on, often fail at. And I have to say, when I do quite a bit of Skype interviews, and Skype is terrible for this. Skype interviews are very stressful because they can be so unstable. Make sure the setting of the interview is right. When we talked about vulnerable people, the setting is very important. So you want to interview someone in a space that it might be a neutral space, but it might be their space, somewhere where they feel safe and comfortable, and they can they can express themselves without feeling too nervous about it. But there's also practical elements too. So places that are not too loud, loud, noisy cafes or whatever are not very good. Places that are, I mean, if it's outside, it might be windy and unpleasant, might be crowded. So, all these sort of things are very, very important. Make sure you get the day and the time right and be on time. These kind of things become really huge. If you're trying to build up networks and contacts and credibility, all this kind of stuff is massively important, and stuff that a lot of people don't think about. They think, oh, my own writing genius will see me through in life. Well, that will only get you so far if you're always late and people give up on you. And I put on make sure you're dressed appropriately. People always dress appropriately nowadays, but I still put that sort of thing in because some people think it's important. Okay, that's the end. I hope you enjoyed the lecture.